The heat at Charter Towers on September 12, 1942, looked alive, rising in thick waves over the scarred Australian airfield. Engines coughed. The tools clattered, and in the middle of that shimmering metal landscape, a single A-20 Havoc rolled toward a tin-walled shelter built from scrap, sandbags, and desperation. Inside stood a 43-year-old man who looked too old, too tired, and too angry to be tinkering with warplanes. But he was about to change the Pacific War with a wrench in one hand and fury in the other. His name was Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn. Everyone knew him as the grease-stained envy mechanic who refused to retire, refused to slow down, and refused to accept that the war should be fought the way the manuals insisted. And on this morning, he was finishing a set of modifications so extreme that pilots whispered he'd lost his mind. In 6 hours, the aircraft he touched with those oil-blackened fingers would tear across the coastline of New Guinea at wave-top height. It would strike a Japanese airfield at Buna before the defenders could even look up. And if Pappy's idea worked, American bombers, once slow, predictable, and badly outgunned, would finally gain the teeth they needed to punch through Japanese convoys, airfields, and supply lines that had been bleeding the Allies dry. But if he was wrong, the crew would die. Pilots would crash into the jungle, and the old man in the tin hangar would become the scapegoat for every failure that followed. Yet Pappy wasn't thinking about failure. He was thinking about his wife. He has 4 children, and the barbed wire fences of the Santo Tomas internment camp are nearly 1,700 miles north of Manila. While he stood sweating over aluminum panels, they were starving behind prison walls, imprisoned simply because they were American. Pappy couldn't reach them. He couldn't help them. But he could make the war shorter, and he intended to do it with firepower no Japanese sailor or pilot had ever imagined. The U.S. Army Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific were losing the battle of tempo. Japanese supply convoys ran night after night, slipping through the fog and rain, reinforcing beachheads and garrisons at will. American bombers flew at 10,000 feet, dropped neatly timed patterns of bomb sand, watched most of them vanish into jungle canopies or splash harmlessly into dark surf. It wasn't enough. Pappy Gunn knew it. General George Kenney knew it. Every pilot who limped home with flak holes in the wings knew it. Something had to change. What Pappy proposed was simple to describe and terrifying to attempt. He wanted to take a bomber and aircraft built to fly level and steady, far above the battlefield, and turn it into a low-level, forward-firing gunship that would roar in like a wild animal at treetop height. He wanted to give it the kind of firepower that could shred anti-aircraft guns, light ships, fuel dumps, and entire flight lines before defenders even reacted. He wanted to turn a medium bomber into a close-range predator. And inside that rattling tin hangar on the edge of Queensland, he was doing it the only way he knew how, with wrecked fighters, salvaged 50-caliber guns, homemade mounts, and instincts sharpened by 20 years of repairing aircraft with his bare hands. The officers who passed by called it recklessly, dangerous, impossible. Pappy Gunn called it necessary. Because while Washington debated doctrine and factories argued over blueprints, Japanese transports were unloading troops on jungle beaches. American soldiers were dying in the mud, and every day that passed was another day his children went hungry in a concrete prison block. This morning, this hot, blinding, unforgiving morning, Pappy didn't see an A-20. He saw a weapon the U.S. needed and the Japanese never expected. Something built not in laboratories or design bureaus, but in sweat and fury. In 6 hours, that aircraft would take off. In 6 hours, men would find out whether his idea was genius or madness. And in 6 hours, the first step toward a new kind of air warfare would rip through the clouds over Buna. This is where the war changed. Not in a strategy meeting, not in a factory, but in a rattling tin hangar under the Australian sun, where one furious father asked a simple question the manuals never asked. What if we just added more guns? Before he ever strapped guns onto bombers, Pappy Gunn was already fighting a war. No one else could see one in the sky, and one in his heart. Pappy Gunn didn't come from privilege, pedigree, or polished academy training. He came from Arkansas, from a blacksmith shop where metal, sweat, and stubbornness shaped the way he saw the world. By the time he was old enough to vote, he was already inside an airplane engine bay, learning how every bolt, every rivet, and every cylinder fit together. That instinct of the ability to feel an aircraft, not just flying, would become the foundation of everything he changed in the Pacific War. He spent 21 years in the Navy, the kind of man who repaired a damaged aircraft faster than other crews could write the paperwork. He flew too first as a Navy aviation pilot, then as a seasoned airman who'd seen more storms, more cracked pistons, and more near misses than most of the younger officers around him. When he retired in 1939, he didn't slow down. He moved his family to the Philippines and helped launch Philippine Airlines, flying Beechcraft across jungles, islands, and coral seas. Passengers trusted him. Mechanics respected him. The pilot tried to copy him. Then, on December 7, 1941 came. The Japanese hit Manila. The Far East Air Force seized Philippine Airlines overnight. Gunn became an Army Air Forces captain whether he wanted to or not. And suddenly he found himself flying unarmed civilian aircraft straight into a collapsing front. For 6 brutal weeks, he flew low-level rescue missions, weaving through jungle valleys and over burning towns, pulling out wounded pilots, stranded soldiers, and anyone else he could fit into his cockpit. He carried ammunition to Bataan. He dodged Zeros in aircraft held together by luck and canvas patches. He crash-landed once into a coconut grove and walked away only because a plantation worker recognized him from a pre-war flight. He saved hundreds, but he couldn't save the people he loved the most. As Manila fell, his wife Clara and their 4 children were caught in the Japanese sweep of civilians and locked inside the Santo Tomas internment camp. Behind the barbed wire, behind guards with rifles, behind 3 years of starvation, rations, and disease. Pappy escaped to Australia in one of the last outbound aircraft, carrying key personnel to safety, but not his family. From that moment on, Pappy Gunn wasn't just a pilot. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a father fighting 2 wars at the same time. The one everyone saw against Japanese convoys, aircraft, and fortified airfields, and the one no one saw against time itself, because every week the war continued was another week his children went hungry in a prison block he couldn't reach. By the time he arrived in Australia, the 5th Air Force was desperate. Bombers were missing ships entirely. Medium-altitude attacks vanished into rain squalls and jungle canopy. Japanese convoys moved freely, dropping troops and supplies wherever they pleased. The official manuals said the war should be fought from altitude. Pappy Gunn had just spent 6 weeks proving altitude meant absolutely nothing in the Pacific. And that's when General George Kenney, new to the theater, stumbled across a strange sight at Charter Towers. A middle-aged man with grease-soaked hands, crouched under an A-20, bolting salvaged .50 caliber guns into the nose of a bomber that had never been meant for strafing. Kenney's staff saw a rule breaker. Kenney saw something else, man, with nothing left to lose, inventing the weapon the theater desperately needed. Gunn wasn't modifying aircraft to impress anyone. He was modifying them to shorten a war that was starving his family. And that combination grief, love, fury, and pure mechanical genius was about to turn a conventional bomber force into the most feared low-level killers in the Pacific. The first proof that Pappy Gunn's madness might actually work came from a single, battered A-20 Havoc sitting in that tin hangar at Charter Towers. He had ripped out the bombardier's plexiglass nose and replaced it with cold metal. No bomb sight, no delicate glass panels, just armor, wires, and 4 salvaged .50 caliber machine guns scrounged from wrecked P-40s and P-39s scattered across Queensland. It looked crude ugly, even. The kind of modification an officer would normally shut down with 3 memos and a stern lecture. But the moment Pappy fired all 4 guns at once, The A-20 bucked like a living thing, and then settled into a steady, murderous vibration that told him everything he needed to know. The concept worked. The aircraft could handle the recoil, and it could kill things at low altitude. The test came on September 12, 1942, over Buna. Pappy's A-20 conversions came in so low their propellers threw spray off the treetops. Before the Japanese gunners could react, those fixed 50 cals lit up. Fuel drums erupted, parked fighters tore apart like cardboard. Para-frag bombs, small canisters slowed by parachutes, floated down onto revetments and wooden huts, exploding midair and showering everything with hot metal and white phosphorus. The raid didn't just succeed stunned commanders. For the first time in the theater, an airfield died fast. General Kenny didn't hesitate. He told Pappy, "Do the same thing to the B-25. That was a much bigger challenge. The B-25 Mitchell wasn't a nimble light bomber, it was a medium twin-engine workhorse, built for straight, level bombing at medium altitude. Cutting off its transparent nose and replacing it with a metal one meant wrenching the aircraft's center of gravity forward. Packing it with heavy Browning machine guns meant violating every weight and balance chart the designers had ever written. But Pappy Gunn didn't design things on paper, he designed them in the field. And the field needed a monster. At Townsville, he and a tiny group of mechanics began the painstaking transformation. Glass nose removed, metal nose installed, gun mounts welded from scrap steel, ammo boxes built from spare sheet metal, wiring harnesses hand-fitted by men who had to guess which circuits would handle recoil vibrations. Soon the first modified Mitchell emerged for 8 forward-firing 50 calls. Then 10, then 12. Pilots who tested the first conversions came back with the same reaction. This thing doesn't fly, it attacks. When a pilot fired all forward guns at once, the recoil shoved the whole aircraft backward in the air. Rivets rattled, my nose dipped, the engines were strained, but the effect on targets was something no Japanese commander had prepared for. A B-25 staffer could throw out nearly 200 rounds per secondary avalanche of half-inch projectiles that shredded wooden ships, tore open parked aircraft, and erased anti-aircraft crews before they could even grab their weapons. Word began to spread through the 5th Air Force. Guns Mitchells don't bomb, they chew. Back in California, North American aviation watched these field reports with growing fascination. Their engineers suggested an official solution, a B-25 mounted with a 75mm cannon on the B-25G. On paper, this was revolutionary, a bomber firing a tank gun. In reality, the recoil rocked the entire airframe so violently that pilots flinched every time they pulled the trigger. The cannon was slow, heavy, temperamental, and quickly abandoned as a primary weapon. Pappy's answer remained the simplest and most brutally effective: more machine guns, more forward fire, more ways to suppress enemy ships at wave-top height. The conversion line at Townsville began turning out these monsters one after another. Pilots trained to fly lower, faster, and deadlier than any medium bomber crew had ever flown before. The B-25 was no longer a medium-altitude bomber, it was now a low-level predator, built to rip holes in Japanese convoys. The Allies had started the war, dropping bombs from the safety of the clouds. Now, thanks to one furious mechanic from Arkansas, they were about to start fighting 50 feet above the ocean, and the Japanese had absolutely no idea what was coming. Modern gunships didn't begin in a laboratory. They began in a tin hangar built by a furious father who refused to accept defeat. By the time the war dragged into 1945, the monsters Pappy Gunn created were everywhere, roaring over New Guinea valleys, slicing across the Philippines coastline, hammering barges, airfields, bridges, and convoys with a level of aggression the Pacific had never seen before. His B-25 strafers became so feared that Japanese reports warned soldiers not to stand and fight when the Mitchells approached. Do not expose yourselves. Their fire is too great. But for Pappy, all the victories, all the raids, all the explosions and wreckage meant only one thing. He was one day closer to finding the family he had been fighting for since Manila fell. In February 1945, American forces broke through the outskirts of Manila and stormed the gates of Santo Tomas University. Behind the battered walls, they found thousands of starved, hollow-eyed civilians imprisoned under brutal conditions. Among them, Pappy Gunn and the 4 children who had survived the unthinkable. Pappy rushed to the camp, and after all the raids, all the wounds, all the nights he lay awake wondering if they were still alive, he finally saw them thin, exhausted, changed forever, but alive. The war had taken nearly everything from him, but it had not taken them. After the war, Pappy retired as a full colonel, the medals on his chest almost comically long for a man who spent most of his career crawling under airplanes instead of sitting behind a desk. He returned to the Philippines, rebuilt Philippine Airlines, and flew again, not with guns blazing, but with passengers sitting comfortably behind him, unaware that their pilot had once redesigned an entire style of warfare with nothing more than salvage, intuition, and rage. On October 11, 1957, Pappy Gunn's luck finally ran out. His Beech-18 went down in a storm, ending the life of a man who had survived dogfights, flak bursts, crashes, and 9 combat wounds. He died over the islands he had fought for and loved. But his legacy didn't die with him. Every gunship that circled over Korea, every AC-47 Spooky that rained fire over Vietnam, every AC-130 Spectre that still flies today with cannons and howitzers, every doctrine book on close air support and strike platforms, all of them carry Pappy Gunn's fingerprints. His insight was brutally simple. Take a stable aircraft, load it with overwhelming forward firepower, fly low, hit first, hit harder than the enemy can respond, and change the battle before the enemy even understands what's happening. He didn't care about elegance. He didn't care about what the manual said. He cared about ending a war quickly enough to save lives, including the lives waiting for him behind barbed wire in Manila. Historians often talk about strategy, generals, fleets, and factories, but they forget the men like Pappy Gunn tinkerers, the mechanics, the improvisers, the ones who look at a weapon, see what it could be instead of what it is, and change history with a handful of tools and a refusal to quit. The Japanese had excellent pilots, strong ships, skilled mechanics. They were capable of any nation fighting in the Pacific, but they didn't have Pappy Gunn, didn't have a man furious enough, desperate enough, brilliant enough to tear apart a bomber's nose and rebuild the future of air warfare in a tin hangar under the Australian sun. So, when modern gunships circle over distant battlefields, when their cannons flash in the night, when their rounds carve through darkness with terrifying precision, they're echoing a question asked by one man in 1942, "What if we just added more guns?"